inviting me to be here today. So I was asked to come here today and to speak about sanctuary as a form of resistance. And I will start with the basic definition of what sanctuary is. And that is that sanctuary is a way to be in solidarity with the undocumented community by creating safe spaces for the prophetic voices of immigrant leaders to be lifted up as we together confront unjust laws. And I'll repeat that one more time because I know it's a wordy definition. Sanctuary is a way to be in solidarity with the undocumented community by creating safe spaces for the prophetic voices of immigrant leaders to be lifted up as we together confront unjust laws. And a church that declares itself to be a sanctuary congregation is one willing to engage on a spectrum of solidarity actions, including welcoming undocumented people, advocating to help stop deportations, assisting with legal clinics, and physically sheltering an immigrant in danger of immediate deportation. So we're going to talk a little bit about what this spectrum entails, but today I'm really going to focus on that last one, which is the most radical act of hospitality, which is sheltering an immigrant in danger of immediate deportation in a congregation. And one of the reasons that I think it's important to be here talking about sanctuary is because I dare to say that sanctuary is the only act of resistance that one can do 24/7, 365 days a year. Which I think is an extremely radical thing to be involved in, because the people who are resisting are both the people who are going against our system that is broken by defying their deportation order and going to live in a church, but also the churches who are saying that we think that this is wrong, and so we are going to provide our space and welcome these people into our spaces. So, like Michael said, I gave you one simplified definition, but sanctuary is many things. It is both a response to the raids and deportations that we are continuing to see, and it's a strategy to fight individual cases of deportation, and also to advocate for an end to mass detention and deportation, and to amplify the voices of our immigrant brothers and sisters. It's a vision for what our communities can be, and also for so many people of faith, it's a moral imperative to take prophetic action of radical hospitality that is rooted in our ancient faith traditions. So there's really two main goals of the sanctuary movement. And the first one is that there is a humanitarian purpose. So when I talk about sanctuary, I'm going to talk again and again about relationships and how sanctuary has to be done in relationship with others. But I want to remember that when we're talking about sanctuary, we're also talking about people. There are almost 50 people who are living in sanctuary in churches. I don't personally know all 50. My organization works with a lot of them. But these are the 4 who are living in sanctuary where I live in North Carolina. So I wish I could tell you their entire story. But Juana has been in sanctuary for over 2 years. She's at the top at St. Barnabas Episcopal Church in Greensboro. She's a grandmother. She loves spending time with her grandchildren, and they come to visit her. Rosa is in sanctuary at a Presbyterian Mennonite church in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. She's hilarious, and she loves to spend her time making jewelry. Jose, who's at the bottom, he's in sanctuary in Durham, North Carolina. He was an evangelical pastor before going into sanctuary. He's extremely religious. He wakes up at 4 a.m. every morning and does a live Facebook stream Bible study if anyone's interested. And Eliseo is in sanctuary in Raleigh at Umstead Park United Church of Christ. And he was a construction worker before going into sanctuary, and now he makes these amazing birdhouse creations. He can make like anything that people want, and he sells them for hundreds of dollars, and that's part of how he raises money for his family while he can't work since he's in the sanctuary. So part of sanctuary is on this individual case-by-case basis, because the goal of sanctuary is not for someone to live in a church forever. The goal of sanctuary is for someone to be able to get out and be with their family and go back to living their lives. So when we're talking about case-by-case management, that means both keeping someone comfortable and providing for their family on a daily basis, and then also the legal strategy, because you do want to keep pushing their case through. But then there's also a broader goal of the sanctuary movement, and that one is really the revelatory story of sanctuary, and that's the broader, that we are doing this movement because our system is broken. So we have to raise up these stories, and we have to raise people's consciousness and awareness and get the attention of our lawmakers so that we can change the system that we have. So many people aren't aware that the sanctuary movement has very, very deep biblical roots. Sanctus is actually Latin, meaning holy, which is where we get our English word for sanctuary. And in the New Testament, in the book of Numbers, there are actually directions for setting up 6 cities of refuge. And these are cities where people could go when they had committed murder, but they hadn't meant to. It wasn't a planned murder. And they could go there, and they would be safe, and they could wait for a just trial. And that's really what sanctuary is about. It's having someone who's able to go somewhere and be safe while they wait for their fair day in court. And really throughout history, we've seen churches stepping up to be sanctuaries. So in World War II, we saw churches as places where Jews could hide. We've seen churches as stops on the Underground Railroad. So consistently, churches have been places where people can be safe, and they've been on the right side of history. The original sanctuary movement began in the 80s and 90s, and I know that there are some people in this room who could speak to this better than I can because I was born in the late 80s. But the sanctuary movement really began in a response to refugees who were fleeing civil wars in Central America. Most of those civil wars were actually funded by our government, but that's a whole different story. So as we were seeing these people fleeing from these wars, they were coming across the border, and they weren't able to seek asylum because our asylum laws were different at the time, although they are still broken, and we are still seeing people fleeing from Central America. This is the first time that we really saw hundreds of churches get involved in this movement and open their doors to people as refugees. And I learned yesterday that actually here in Champaign, there were churches that were actually involved here in the sanctuary movement, which I think is really interesting to know that where we are today has been involved in the sanctuary movement before and can be part of the sanctuary movement again. So moving ahead in time, back into 2007 under President Obama, we really saw the deportation machine begin to start up and the creation of ICE. And really, I know we think about President Obama as, oh, things were better back then for immigrants. But Obama was still considered the deporter-in-chief. So these deportations, these raids, they were still happening. So that's really when we saw the resurgence of the new sanctuary movement. But at that time, it was only a handful of sanctuary cases. It was between 6 and 10, and people weren't staying in sanctuary very long. They would be in sanctuary for weeks or months, and then they would be able to leave. Fast forward to 2016 and the election, and suddenly under President Trump's executive orders, the definition of who a criminal is changed. So we always talk about how we prioritize deportation of criminals. But now anyone who has come here illegally or has overstayed a visa is a criminal, hands down, even if you haven't committed any other crimes. So really everyone is at risk for deportation. So in 2016, we saw just an explosion of the sanctuary movement. These numbers, actually, the 1,140 are from our sanctuary report last year, so they are outdated. That's why I had to update the 46. That's why it's in a different font. So there's currently 46 people in sanctuary, and those numbers of houses of worship have grown, and number of state networks and coalitions have grown. But there are currently 46 people living in sanctuary. But the thing is that people are staying in sanctuary longer and longer. So people are staying in sanctuary for years, not weeks or months. And this has to do with the reason that we used to rely on private bills as a way for people to get out of sanctuary. And the rules have changed for how you can even enter a private bill. So you have to have the head of a committee and create that private bill and enter it. And all the heads of committees are all Republicans. So it's almost impossible to be able to even sponsor a private bill to get someone out of sanctuary. So we're really having to look for new tactics to be able to get people out. So how are churches able to do this? So ICE actually sent out its own memo declaring certain places to be sensitive locations where they would not enter into and would not make arrests. So these are basically 3 places, and those are churches, schools, and community health centers or hospitals. And so far, we have not seen them break this policy. We have not seen them go into any of these places and make arrests. That could change because this is just a memo. It's not a law. It could change at any day. But so far, ICE has respected its own policy, and it's really a church being able to use this policy against them so that people can stay there and feel safe. And I will speak a little bit. I know the big question that I always get is this legal, yes or no? And I like to say that this policy is kind of like scripture. It's up to interpretation. Different courts have ruled different ways, and we really haven't seen anyone be prosecuted in this new sanctuary movement. In the previous sanctuary movement, a good number of faith leaders were arrested, but none of them served hard jail time. It was all either fines or house arrest, but no one served serious time. So really, it's difficult to say what's at risk. So when I talk to people about is it legal or not, I always tell people what the worst case scenario is for harboring, but at the same time, we really haven't seen people be prosecuted in that way, so it's a gray area of yes or no. But the idea behind it really is that you're doing public sanctuary. So when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about People who have declared that we have someone living here, they tell ICE, and the idea is that they are not harboring because it's not hiding. You're saying they're here, we're proud that they're here, and we want you to know that. Versus there is such a thing as private sanctuary. When people ask me about private sanctuary, I say, I don't know about it, and I shouldn't know about it because that means they're doing it correctly. Is it happening? Sure. I'm sure there are people who are keeping people in their homes or their churches and they're doing it privately. But this is something different. This is where you have a big press conference and you say to the world, this person is here. Most people in Sanctuary are very comfortable with the media. They're used to telling their story. They do it all the time. And they're really willing to put themselves out there. People in Sanctuary are leaders because they're really not afraid to come out and say, I'm here. And making the decision to go into Sanctuary is such a huge decision because once you put your story out there like that, there's no going back. ICE knows where you are. People now know who you are. You can't even go out in your town because people will say, oh, I saw you. So it's not the same thing as when we think about this, as they're leaders in their community because they are willing to put so much at risk and to put themselves front and center at this movement. So a couple of ways of how to do Sanctuary. Let me check on my time. Okay. So doing Sanctuary, I'll talk a little bit just about the logistics that are required and responsibilities, and then we can move on to some steps. So what kind of infrastructure is needed? The idea with Sanctuary is that the person that is living there should feel comfortable. So that involves many things. It involves having a safe space. One, they need to feel safe. But then they also need to have the logistics around them. So that includes their own privacy. We often think of churches as very open and people coming and going, and we have community groups and we host these meetings and events. So they need a place where they can be on their own and just have that space for themselves. Also a bathroom. A shower is the big one that people focus on a whole lot, is the shower. We have to have a shower. And yes, you do need a shower for someone to be comfortable and to live there. But I often tell people, don't let the shower be the one thing that keeps you from doing this. If you really want to do Sanctuary, you will find a way to get a shower. So those are the general just infrastructure, but also thinking about day-to-day needs. So they aren't able to, maybe if there's not a washing machine there, you need someone to be able to do their laundry. Someone making them meals, but also people coming and visiting with them, and because they need to have ways to spend their time. I mean, when you think about it, you're just staying in a church all day. How are you going to pass the time? And then another best practice that I suggest is that having a volunteer there 24/7 for safety reasons. So that would mean in case ICE came, they would be there and they would be trained to interact with ICE to document what's happened. But then also, what if there is some sort of health emergency? People who are in Sanctuary are not getting any sort of preventative health care for years. So if you think about how often we go to the doctor or the dentist, many of the people who are going into Sanctuary are already older and may already go in with health problems. So having a medical emergency is a very big, very real possibility, and it has happened. So having someone there who's trained and knows what to do and is able to respond. But when you think about that, so I've named a couple things, that's a huge amount of volunteers that you need to have, a huge amount of manpower. Also, a huge amount of financial support. So when people go into Sanctuary, I recommend that the church make a covenant with the person in Sanctuary where they clearly lay out what they are responsible for and what they are not responsible for, and that they revisit that covenant every 6 months to see if it's working. Because the church is really making a promise to that person that we are going to be here and keep you safe and support you. And what does supporting someone look like, especially financially because they're not able to work? So are you just supporting them, or are you supporting them and their whole family? And who is in their family? Because many people have very large and extended families. And how long are we going to support you for? Does this support end when you get out of Sanctuary, or are we going to continue? Legal support, that is also very expensive. So how is the church going to sustain that? Because sustainability is huge. When we're talking about 1, 2, 3 years in Sanctuary, this isn't something where it's just like we need to raise the funds once and we'll be done. It's a continual process, and I can tell you that people get burnt out and that people get sick of you continually going to them and asking them for money. So how are you going to do this? And it's something that you really need to think about before you go in. A few other considerations that I suggest that people take up that sometimes they might rush through just because either they have someone who really needs it and we got to do this right now, or because they're just really excited about this work. What is your appetite for risk? Like, how much are you willing to put on the line for this? How used to are you with dealing with the media and with public scrutiny? Because you are going to get pushback from people. And then also, what are your relationships with people in the community? I meet a whole lot of really well-meaning churches who don't have relationships already with the immigrant community. So if you haven't formed those relationships and that trust, people aren't going to feel safe living in your walls. So that's a huge one that I confront on a daily basis of people who are like, even churches who've already gone through the process and they're ready to go, and they say, why isn't anyone coming who needs it? We know that there are people who need sanctuary, and it's most likely because people aren't sure that they would be safe within your congregation. So you really need to lay that foundation by talking with people beforehand. Which the other one, the big one, is following the lead of the most affected. So how is the person in sanctuary? They should be the ones controlling the narrative. So really today, I should not be the person up here standing in front of you. Someone in sanctuary should be the person standing up in front of you, telling you their story about how they went into sanctuary. But unfortunately, it's impossible for them to be able to be here. But making sure that you are not the ones controlling the narrative, that the person in sanctuary is always controlling the narrative, that they are the ones making decisions about their case. And this can be really hard, especially in a white supremacist culture that we live in. So we've really started trying to focus on anti-racist training as part of an education when people are going into this process. I'm going to be doing an anti-racist training tonight at the Unitarian Church, and it's really work that we're just starting to get into. It's not perfect, it's messy, we're not doing it perfectly, but it's something that we've really seen as important, especially the longer that people are staying in the sanctuary, because there are a lot of power dynamics related to mainly white congregations giving sanctuary and protecting black and brown bodies. So once a church has decided that this is something that they really want to start exploring, here are the basic steps. There's no one right way to do sanctuary. People do them in different order. It looks different in local context. It's going to look different by denomination. So this is just a basic list, but this is not like a hard and fast checklist that you have to follow. So I talked a little bit about the educational piece. Learning from people at risk of deportation and starting to build those relationships, connecting with people who are already doing sanctuary. And this is where my organization can help people. So this is a national movement with coalitions all over the country, and these are people who are happy to share their expertise. So talking with other people who are in sanctuary, but also talking with other organizers, talking with other pastors. There are so many people who are willing to share their experiences and their wisdom. And so really reaching out and knowing that this is a national movement and you don't have to do it on your own. Articulating why you believe sanctuary work is important and why you believe undocumented people should be allowed in the U.S. So being on the same page about the reasons that your church or your congregation wants to do this is so important to be on the exact same page and remember what is guiding you, because this can be frustrating work. Sometimes it feels very hopeless, but just remembering why you started this in the first place. So from there, you would actually start to build a team and start mobilizing your congregation. Different churches do it different ways with different teams. I usually recommend that there at least be a hospitality team, so someone who is there working on day-to-day, what do people need? Do they have groceries for the week? Are these volunteer roles filled? A media team that can field press calls, that can organize interviews, that can spin the narrative in the way that you want. And then finally, an organizing team that's more responsible for how is this person's campaign going? What do we need to be doing? Is there a legal team on top of everything? So those are the three that I recommend, but that's not a one-size-fits-all. Different congregations do different things. So for example, Rosa, who I showed in one of the slides, she makes pupusas every Sunday and sells them after church. And she's wildly successful at this, but she has an entire pupusa team. And they make sure that she has all of her ingredients, that her mixer is working. And so that's just something that this congregation has developed out of the need because she is so successful at making these pupusas. Then assessing the role and capacity of your congregation. So one thing that I recommend when I do these trainings is that before you go into this, if you are able to, sometimes it's an emergency situation, but if you're able to, that you already have 100 volunteers signed up, because many of the people who sign up are never actually going to show up, so you really need about 50 to 70, but if you have 100 on a list, that's where I recommend that you start from, because you really are going to need a huge amount of capacity, and that is really hard to sustain, but that's where I recommend that you start. And then continue in your prayerful critical reflection about how your congregation is going to be in solidarity. And some other ways, if you're interested in getting involved in the sanctuary, well, I'll start with the spectrum first, then we'll talk about getting involved in the sanctuary movement. So This is kind of a basic spectrum that I start with when I go into congregations. I go work in many, many different congregations, so for many people, it is starting with an awareness. I think that because immigration is in the news so often right now, there is a higher level of awareness, but sometimes it's very skewed awareness based on where you are getting your news from. So really raising awareness and talking about basics is something that I do a lot, just about our immigration system. How did we get here where we are? How do you get a visa? So those very basic things, which then moves you into education, which is where a history, I would love it if we could have time to go into a whole history of our immigration system, which we don't, but also that anti-racist framework that I was talking about. Then congregations kind of move into discernment of where do they want to be in this. Is it something where, we really support the work that you're doing, but, actually doing the sanctuary work isn't for us, but we would love to raise some money for you and donate it to this. Or we would love to help start a bail fund to be able, when people are in detention, to be able to get them out. Or we really want to be working with refugees that are coming to our community. So that's kind of where we fall. So that there's that level of discernment that I often try to help congregations sort of lead them through that process. Proclamation, so preaching about immigrants is something that I do all the time, but just being out there and showing up is a huge one. If congregations will just show up for their other immigrant brothers and sisters, that makes a very large difference. Then you move on to acts of service and acts of justice, which being a physical sanctuary is definitely one, but other ways to get involved in the sanctuary movement. Yes, donating is a huge one. Also, accompaniment, so accompaniment to court is a ministry that many congregations take on. Also, visiting people in detention centers can be a big one. There's a great pastoral need for people to go to detention centers and actually spend time with people. Then rapid response is a huge one that I've been talking about a lot. So we are seeing raids happening every day. Where I live in North Carolina, a couple weeks ago, there was a targeted raid. We had 6 sheriffs in North Carolina who refused to cooperate with ICE, and in retaliation, there were 3 days of raids and over 200 people were picked up. And it's continuing. So we are seeing this kind of response, and it's something that's happening, and we need to be prepared, because if you're not prepared, there's nothing you can do after the raid happens. I mean, you can help people get out of detention, but it's much harder. So being prepared in advance for a raid is so important. So having that sort of hotline or text message, we have like a text message thread where you sign up, and then we have actually a verifier program. So people who, like me, have the privilege of citizenship are trained, and when somebody says, oh, I saw a car in my neighborhood, and it could be an ICE car, if someone else, they send out a message, if somebody close by in the area, could you go and check? And so you go and you check and you look at the car. If there's someone there, you say, excuse me, you're not familiar with you. What are you doing in my community? And if they say, oh, I'm just visiting a friend, you say, oh, okay. But it's just a way to make people feel more safe, because so many times the reports that we're hearing often aren't true. And that's one of the problems with social media. Somebody puts something, a picture of a car, everybody freaks out, and then nobody lets their kids go to school for the day. And that's not what we want. So really training people to be able to respond quickly to those sorts of situations. So rapid response, accompaniment, visitation, those are some of the main ones that I'm thinking of right now, but I would also welcome any suggestions that you all have as well. So I'm going to show a video right now, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about just some lessons that I've learned, and then we'll have time for questions.
Two million people that are legally in this country today. And what are they going to do? With the snap of their fingers, they're going to take them from being documented in this country and legal in this country to being undocumented.
We've had a historic relationship with Luis. We've kicked off a lot of campaigns here. Whatever campaign it was, whether we were getting Barack to go for an executive order or we were trying to get stop the deportations movement on something else, and this traditionally has been a way to kick off and so forth. And it's a known church in the movement. Filson remains kind of the root from which a lot of people came through. They came back to this church when we're in need of unity.
Whether you're brown, white, papers or no papers, we're going to make sure democracy works for you. And we're starting it here this afternoon at this marvelous church. Thank you so much.
So the moment that Donald Trump was elected, our community was filled with fear. These massive deportations that he's threatening with his administration are real. And we need to wake up, and we need to put a plan together how we're going to keep our families together.
when Em and I got together was after 1987. We had a coalition against the Chicago 21 plan, was to stop the general gentrification that was going on. And we included a lot of organizations throughout the city, but one of them that we included was here from Pilsen, that added the issue of the undocumented into the struggles.
We have a ministry that was developed through the leadership of Elvira Arellano.
Yo comencé a venir todos los domingos. El pastor Walter Coleman hablaba acerca de que se tenían que reunificar las familias, y es cuando pues la pastora Emma y yo empezamos a organizar Familia Latina Unida.
Íbamos a Washington, yo tenía mis gemelitas de 2 años y mi niña de 1 año más, 3. Elvira con Saúl, todas batallando con los niños, llorando. A veces no nos dormíamos en el piso cuando nos daban por ahí posada.
Our church is where people come with their cases, desperate, saying, help us. What we provide for them is workshops, prepare them for the worst.
Hace 14 años que yo llegué a esta iglesia y aquí he tenido todo el apoyo que ellos me han brindado. Y la esperanza que yo tengo de poder quedarme aquí es con la ayuda de mis pastores, que nunca me han dejado sola. Yo casi los veo como mis papás porque ellos han sufrido conmigo desde que mis hijos estaban chiquitos. Ellos están viendo la posibilidad de que yo me pueda quedar.
She's not a threat to this country's homeland security. This is a mom. Why would we allow her to be separated from her children? It's wrong, and we're going to stand up and fight, but we need all the churches to be sanctuaries. It was because of Elvira Arellano that the new sanctuary movement began.
Esta iglesia, mi pastor Walter Coleman lo declaró santuario para protegerme de la deportación, y la pastora Emma Lozano siempre estuvo apoyándome moralmente, emocionalmente, todo el tiempo que yo estuve en santuario.
Well, God, we just thank you for this day.
Te damos gracias, Señor, por este día
We thank you for those that are here.
y por todos que han llegado aquí.
And we thank you for the bond that ties us together with those from whom we are separated.
And we're going to fight Donald Trump, and we're going to win, because justice always prevails. And those fights that are hard fought, and those victories that you get that are not easy, are the only ones that are worthwhile in our lifetime. And that's the fight we're in right now. And I'm just happy to be here at this time, at this juncture. I'm sad for the crisis that we're confronting, but we're preparing ourselves for the fight of our lives.
So that was I tried to pick a local example. There are 3 people who are in sanctuary in Chicago. So that was a church in Chicago. And I thought of 2 more things while that video was going, of ways that you can get involved. One is know your rights. So along with rapid response, just knowing your rights right now is extremely important. So hosting those kinds of workshops and bringing in people who can help people, but also just knowing it in general, so that if you're somewhere and that you see someone's rights being violated, that you can speak up and be able to stop what's happening. And then the third one was, what was my third one? Oh, ICE cooperation in your local area. So I know that recently you elected a new sheriff here in Champaign. So figuring out, like, how is local law enforcement working with ICE in your community, and being very open and honest about that, and then talking about, well, why are you working that way? I don't know if the sheriff is good or bad here, but talking with them and figuring them out, and then trying to figure out ways to limit cooperation with ICE in your local area. So I just want to end with some of the things that I've learned from doing this work. It has changed me personally. This work can often feel very hopeless, because right now there aren't a lot of options for people who are in sanctuary legally. And so it can be very, very hard to tell people, just wait till 2020. Well, it was just wait till 2018, and maybe if we can win the House. And now it's like, well, we're still not getting anywhere. And so telling people to just sit and wait, but that patience that people have, this willing to continue to fight no matter what, even when there's people like me saying, I'm working, I don't know what to do. People in sanctuary have so much patience, and that is something that I so want to learn from. And when organizing and working in any sort, whether it's immigrant rights, women's rights, gun rights, anything, change comes very slowly. So that patience that sanctuary leaders have has really encouraged me as an organizer to learn to wait and to continue to fight. Even if we don't see change, change is coming. So the other one is faith. So paciencia y fe. If you're a fan of In the Heights and Lin-Manuel Miranda, you'll know that reference. But patience and faith. So people who are in sanctuary are extremely faithful people. To be willing to go and live in a church, you've probably grown up in a church and feel pretty comfortable. But these are people of great, deep faith. And I'm a person of faith too, but I've really thought about my faith when I look at the way that they just continue to rely on God, and that God will provide for them. So we have, every week, my organization organizes weekly video conferences so that people in sanctuary can talk with one another and share with one another. And it's really more of a mental health release so that they can talk to each other, because the only other person who can understand what it's like to live in sanctuary is someone else living in sanctuary. And I am the only citizen who's on these calls. I don't talk a lot, but I definitely listen. And just hearing their deep faith and their, they know that God is watching with them, that God is with them, and that this struggle will end up all right. And being able to hear them say that gives me hope as an organizer, and really helps me to remember why I do this work. So thank you, and I will take questions. Yes.
So I'm preoccupied with this idea of private sanctuary. I realize it's a clandestine service and impossible to know. I admire the churches for doing it forthrightly. They have a bit of protection because of the tradition of sanctuary. But I don't know. It's not much of a question, but I just wonder what's going on in a lot of these private sanctuary circumstances. People are so vulnerable. There's no way of getting a handle on how much of that's going on. Just speaking from frustration.
To repeat, it wasn't really a question, but more of just a frustration. So you're not the only person who wonders about private sanctuary. I get calls from reporters every day, and they want to talk about it, and it's like one of those things where I'm like, I really want to help you, but I can't because I don't know about it, and I shouldn't. But I can say, so for example, there was a woman in Ohio who recently left sanctuary in a church, and she was in private sanctuary. So I did not know about her case, but she was able to get a U visa, and she recently left. So that is an example that churches are doing this, and that it's happening, and I wish them well. Yes. Yes, so the question was about communities of churches working together. And sanctuary cannot be done in a vacuum. It cannot be done by one church. And most of the churches that are giving sanctuary are not large churches. Like there's no mega church that has declared sanctuary. The church that Juana is at in Greensboro is a tiny congregation of less than 50 people, mostly above the age of 60. So we're not talking about these like huge churches that you think about that have really big budgets. So churches really do have to work together. This is one of the reasons that we see it more often in an urban setting where there are maybe more like-minded churches around. But we definitely see connectionalism in churches working together. A lot of churches that I work with already have good relationships with other churches, but we've also seen some churches come around that maybe wouldn't have been as progressive in the area of immigration, but they recognize that this is a community member who is in need, and that while they might not be as fan of going so far as like talking about ICE and ICE activity in their community, they are okay with bringing someone a meal. And they're used to doing that because they're used to visiting people in their homes who might be homebound. And they kind of think of it just as an extension of that ministry. So yeah, working together with other churches. I mean, most coalitions that I work with, I would say there's usually maybe 5 really active congregations, and then probably 10 others or so that contribute some volunteers. We also see it's not just Christian congregations, but also our Muslim and our Jewish brothers and sisters as well. And also with people being in sanctuary for so long, we've seen people need to reach out to even farther, just to like groups like Girl Scout troops or Rotary clubs. So really getting other groups involved as well that might not even have faith-based, that aren't even faith-based. Yes?
What is the history? I know there have been some very well-publicized cases of people being lured out and being taken by ICE and some really tragic stories. But what about what percentage of people over the last few years have been in sanctuary and been able to go through the process and be able to stay and come out of sanctuary?
So the question is, what is the percentage of people who've been able to go through the process and come out of sanctuary? And I do not know the exact percent. I could look it up. So my organization does track who goes into sanctuary, who goes out of sanctuary, and why. I can tell you that it's not a huge percentage rate. It's not a great success rate. The cases that have been won are few and far between, and they usually come down to the discretion of a judge. So the judges that are appointed have huge powers in this situation, and they often have to due to very extreme circumstances. So having a child who's extremely sick and only has one parent who's able to provide, that was an example in Greensboro. A woman was able to leave. She had one son who was so sick, he was also blind, and she was the only person who was in the country and able to provide for them, and he needed to be in the United States for medical care. So that's an extreme situation. Some people also choose to self-deport. There are people, I mean, it's a difficult process, and at some point, you get very frustrated and you say, why am I doing this? And if a person chooses to self-deport, the church should always honor the wishes of those in sanctuary. So sometimes it can be hard for a church to let go of that control that they've had, but that's part of honoring the wishes of someone in sanctuary and saying, you know, we support you in whatever you decide to do. And I will say there also have been cases of people being so frustrated that they've actually left sanctuary as a tactic to try and go to their senator's office and say, I'm here, you have to see me, you have to acknowledge me, I need your help. And that's a more risky tactic, because when you're doing that, you know that you could be picked up by ICE. But it also just comes out of that frustration of I have to do something, and I have to do something now. The question is, have there been ICE raids in this town? I don't know the answer, but I'm getting a sense of yes from the audience. Almost weekly. Yes?
Is there any documentation of ICE violating sanctuary?
The question is if there's documentation of ICE violating sanctuary. There is none of them entering into a church. The only case that I know of is that there was a case in Virginia where there was a church that had some sort of medical ministry for homeless people to be able to stay overnight to avoid the cold. And there were 2 undocumented people who were there overnight, and then they left in the morning and they were off the church property. ICE was waiting for them to pick them up. That was several years ago in Virginia. But technically they were off the property, but that does mean that ICE is surveilling and watching people. And so they're definitely, people ask like, well, is ICE actually like watching people in sanctuary? And the answer is in some cases, yes, definitely they are. Yes, question?
So this is kind of related to your comment. I think that one of the frustrations in knowing how active ICE is in the community is it's been really hard for people who are trying to document, because a lot of times the family doesn't want to report it because there are other members that are afraid of saying something that ICE will come back and get other members of the family or neighbors or cousins. And so it tends to be word of mouth a lot of times through school
That's a very good question. I will say the Lutheran Immigrant and Refugee Services has a very good toolkit for creating faith-based groups that can go and visit, because there are ways that pastors can get into detention centers more easily to visit people and offer pastoral care. So there have been church groups that are able to get into these facilities more easily than just if you're trying to go and don't know who to visit. To your second point about people, about not knowing in the community who's being taken because people are afraid to speak up, which is definitely true. I think that having a presence in those communities where people, like some sort of communication network where people are able to talk amongst themselves and say what's happening, and this gets into questions of technology and who's watching what, and I know it's complicated, but those sorts of networks of people being able to share information are really important. And then being able, I talked about the verifiers. When you're talking about word of mouth can be very scary. And so having people who are actually able to use their citizenship and go out and say yes or no, the ICE presence is here or not. So I got a text message this morning that said we think that ICE is in Carborough, which is near where I live. And then we got a second text message that said, yes, it's been verified. And then past that were pictures. So really trying to document what's happening. And then the third thing that you brought up that I also wanted to mention, when we're talking about whether or not, we haven't seen any pastors be arrested because of the sanctuary movement, but where we have seen ICE retaliate is against members of families of people who are in sanctuary who are also undocumented, or organizers who work with the sanctuary movement who are undocumented. So, for example, my organization, one of my colleagues who also does sanctuary trainings, and she works with the people who are in sanctuary. I work more as a liaison with congregations and coalitions. She works directly with people in sanctuary. She is formerly undocumented. She's now married to a citizen and is working on changing her status, but that takes a long time. So she's still in the process, and it's a very real concern for my organization that she could be retaliated against because of the work that she's doing. So the question was about sanctuaries being targeted by white supremacist attacks. I haven't seen white supremacist attacks. What you see more is more angry local citizens who I wouldn't necessarily call as extreme as white supremacists. But I mean, I definitely think that as a sanctuary congregation, you should definitely be prepared for backlash in terms of getting hate mail, getting really angry voicemails. And some sanctuaries have actually had vandalism, but that's more rare. What I see more often is like passive aggressive things, like calling the fire marshal to report them, or like trying to get them in trouble for like tinier, smaller like city violations and get them fines and things like that. It hasn't been like huge things like attacks of violence. I think we have been concerned about ICE raids. That is definitely something, an increased ICE presence. It's more worried about the safety of the individual in sanctuary and making sure that they feel safe regardless.
Can you comment on sort of the status of the new sanctuary movement as a national movement, 40 plus, 46 congregations now? Is there a unified political strategy? Is this leveraged in any particular way to move the needle? I know you work in Washington some too. So can you comment on, is that effective? Do we need more congregations in sanctuary to make it effective?
So the question was about the sanctuary movement nationally and like how we are sort of organizing. So when the sanctuary movement was just a handful of cases, it was more unified and like one strategy. Now that the sanctuary movement has exploded into like over 50 coalitions, people all across the country doing this, it has become much more localized. So even though my organization does work on some level with a certain cases, we're not the only organization, and we definitely aren't we have one strategy, other people might have other strategies. And we are definitely in contact with one another, but for example, the strategy that I talked about of people actually leaving sanctuary. I mean, we say that it's always the decision of the people in sanctuary, but there would be other groups that might push for things that are more radical. So I would say that we don't have one unified strategy, and there's definitely like local groups working on specific cases, which I think is important, but they might not have the same strategy. Somebody in Colorado might not have the same strategy as somebody in North Carolina. So my organization organizes also monthly calls for organizers to try and get some of that communication, but obviously we can't reach everyone because the movement is just too big now. And we do need lots of people working. To your question about do we need more sanctuary congregations, I always think yes. And it's a question of what is the tipping point, in my opinion, of like how many churches do we have to get to, and then when will ICE actually enter into a congregation? Like, what is that number? And I don't know what that is. And is that what we're pushing for? I think we're pushing for as many people who need sanctuary to have those congregations ready to go. But also we're seeing a reticence of people to go into sanctuary because, and I understand this, if I were to look at somebody else in sanctuary and say they've been there for 2 years, and it doesn't look like they're going anywhere, would I want to do that? So while I think there are many people who need safety from deportation, there are people who don't want to do that in a church, and I absolutely understand that and respect that. And it's everyone's choice about how they move forward.
Your title is tied in with Church World Service, which is part of the National Council of Churches. So could you say what any of the national church organizations have done to either give you resources or give you at least policy support or advocate on your behalf?
Do you mean denominationally or?
Well, your organization is an expression of that, of the national church.
So yes, so Church World Service is made up of, I'm not sure the exact number, but about close to 40 or 50 denominational bodies, yes, nationally. And not every one of those participates in the sanctuary movement. So Church World Service is a very broad organization. We also work on hunger relief. You might know the Crop Walk. We have refugee resettlement offices all over the country. We do disaster relief. So not every congregation who necessarily participates in a crop walk is participating in the sanctuary movement. So the work of Church World Service is so broad and diverse that it's not necessarily every single one of those denominations. But I would say that within the sanctuary movement, we do see a broad list of denominations that participate in the work that I do. Does that help answer your question? Yes.
Another category of opposition would be like the dominionist Christianity, fundamentalists, right-wingers, whatever you call it. What kind of confrontations, dialogue, outreach, or things are going on with that? I assume something's happening inside of churches.
So the question is about people sort of on the other sides of the pews, so maybe more conservative streams of Christianity. I mean, honestly, those churches aren't necessarily involved in working with the sanctuary movement, but there is a very interesting stream of evangelical Christians. So there's something called the Evangelical Christian Roundtable. That really takes the mandate to welcome the immigrant and welcome the stranger seriously. And so even though I would say I'm probably not on the same page with them about a lot of other social justice issues, they take immigration very seriously, and we're able to work on the same side. So there are some evangelical groups that do support not necessarily sanctuary in the sense of breaking laws, but in the sense of needing to change the need for immigration reform. So we have had success with having a broader range of both more progressive and more conservative streams of Christianity working together, because we know that immigration reform at a federal level, which is the ultimate goal here, would be to change policy and to not have to have a sanctuary movement, will have to come from a bipartisan solution. Yeah, so Catholic churches have been very active in the sanctuary movement. They were very active in the original sanctuary movement in the 80s and 90s. We still see certain dioceses being very active, like many different ways that churches are organized. They're organized separately, and some dioceses may choose to support sanctuary, some may not, and some may even say, even if my diocese doesn't support sanctuary, my congregation is still going to do it. The fact that many undocumented people, many Latinos are Catholic, speaks to the fact that some churches may not be able to be sanctuaries because other people in their congregation are undocumented, and being a sanctuary would put those people at risk. So we don't see as many Catholic churches being sanctuaries in terms of giving physical sanctuary, but we see many as being sanctuary supporting.
What are your thoughts and experience of working with local law enforcement on resisting ICE raids and ICE involvement in the community, and also what are the legal implications?
So asking about like local policies and my experience working with local law enforcement or with ICE? So working with local law enforcement, and I'm going to speak to my experience in North Carolina. Like I said, we've had 6 sheriffs who said they won't cooperate with local law enforcement. So where I live is kind of different because most people are not wanting to cooperate with ICE. So I've had good experiences bringing faith communities to talk with local law enforcement. We also have a lot of really proactive programs in North Carolina, such as a community ID card, which I know they have in Chicago as well, which really increases trust in the community so that the undocumented population isn't afraid to interact. So personally in North Carolina, I've had good experiences. I haven't worked in as many other places. I haven't had as much experience working with ICE. I would say my experiences with them have been when they are coming to pick someone up, so that is never a good interaction. So I think my experience is more like regionally. I just kind of come from a place in the country that is in kind of a progressive bubble, and that's kind of why we have a sanctuary movement that has really taken off. Any other questions? Well, I think we're about at time. So thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's been a pleasure.